Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started now. It is, there we go. It's 2 o'clock, it looks like. So I'm gonna go ahead and get talking about cut flowers, which is one of my favorite topics. I love flowers more than almost anything else on this planet. And so growing flowers to bring inside to me is almost just exciting as growing flowers to enjoy outside. And as you guys have probably noticed, here in Utah, we've been having some really hot days. So, you can take your flowers from your garden, bring them inside, and enjoy them where you can actually enjoy life because it's not 100 degrees. Hopefully, it's not 100 degrees in your house, but cut flowers are surprisingly easy to grow. So the way that this class is going to be kind of structured is we're going to talk about the basics of proper growing practices for all plants in general, because it's going to apply to trees and shrubs and bulbs. We're going to talk about all of the basics of growing a good flower garden, and then we're going to get into some specifics. We're going to talk about annuals, perennials, trees, shrubs, some bulbs that some of my favorites that you can try growing in your own garden to cut and bring inside to enjoy indoors. So just a little bit of background on Weber Basin Water Conservancy District. So we are one of the largest water suppliers in northern Utah. And part of our mission, besides just supplying water, is we want to help people learn how to use that water efficiently, because water that we don't use in one area we can save for future populations, we can use in different areas. So by conserving water, we end up saving money because we don't have to build large projects for new water, which also has a huge environmental impact. So that's my goal here at Weber Basin Water Conservancy District. My name is Janice Terry, and I run our learning garden, and so it just kind of makes sense that I help teach these classes. So we're going to go ahead and get started. When you're thinking about planting, oh, I guess I should say this. So it looks like we have a pretty small group here right now. We will be recording this class, so if you miss something or you need to reference a slide, we're going to have the slides as well as the video recording of this class up on our website, which is weberbasin.com. Hopefully by Monday, we're going to say hopefully by Monday we can have it up. Give us a week though, and if you don't see it, email me and let me know, and I will get it to you if you need it. Zoom is not the best platform that we found to ask questions as we go along. So if I see that somebody raises their hand, I'm just going to ignore it and keep moving. It's not because I don't like you, it's because I don't really have a good way to answer those through this platform. So type your questions in the Q&A box, and then if I don't answer it as we go along, I'll make sure to get to it at the end of class. So there's quite a bit here. We're going to try and clip along and get it done. I think we can get it done in an hour, but it might be a little more with questions. So we're jumping back into flowers now that you have that background. So the first thing you're going to want to really look at is the space that you have to grow a cut flower garden. I am notorious every single spring. I buy way more plants than I have room for. I buy way more seeds than I have space for. And I need to internalize this principle of, before you buy anything or plant anything, make sure that you have really looked over the space that you're planning on putting your flowers in. And there are lots of different ways to grow cut flower gardens. So I recently moved into a house with a proper yard, which is very exciting for me. But before that, I lived in some townhouses, and I had a like 10-foot by 10-foot pad of concrete. And I grew so many plants and so many flowers in containers. Like, my neighbors would make comments all the time about my flower garden. You can grow quite a lot of stuff in containers. So if that's the space that's available to you, utilize it. And we're going to talk about it as we go along. But containers are really awesome because you have almost 100% control over that growing situation. small spaces, they're easier to shade if you need to. You have control over the exact media that the plant's being grown in. You have all the control over the water. They're easy to keep pests at bay, and it's easy to monitor smaller spaces. So like in this image, we have a hydrangea, and hydrangeas are amazing cut flowers, as you guys probably know if you've ever looked or been into a flower shop. They have an incredibly long base life, and they actually do okay in pots. And then you can see the ivy that's growing around it. This English ivy also has a very long base life. So I love this picture because it's just kind of illustrating, like, you know, you can grow a lot in a small space just by proper plant selection. Maybe you don't have a ton of room, but you have a couple of flower beds. And I think it's a great idea to stick flowers in your flower beds that can work as cut flowers as well. So here we have an image. It looks like it's mostly annuals, but we have some perennials in there. Sunflowers are one of the easiest cut flowers to grow, and they also have a good long base life, and they're so versatile. And they're kind of a fun one because they last so long. Like season wise, blooming wise, they bloom from the end of summer until it freezes. So they're kind of fun. And then if you're really blessed and have a ton of space, maybe growing a couple of rows, reserving a couple of rows of garden space for cut flowers can be kind of a fun thing to do. So these are ranunculus. These are a really cute little cut flower. Really great shelf life. We treat them like an annual in our area. We're going to talk about ranunculus in detail in a bit, but you can grow a ton of flowers in a small space. And bringing them inside is just going to, you know, I love any type of greenery or any type of plant material indoors. I have so many houseplants and orchids. I'm pretty sure my roommates think I'm slightly crazy, but I enjoy it, and that's what's important. So we're going to talk a little bit about the space, right? So I've talked just barely about how I'm not very good at paring down my wish list to fit my space. But really think about it. It's I waste money every year. I buy too many seeds, I buy too many plants, and I try and make them work, but oftentimes things end up going to waste. And make sure to give yourself space to work and move. One of the most, well, the most stiff I've ever been was trying to harvest peppers that were too close together. So my background, I have a degree in plant science from Utah State University. And while I was going to school, I worked at the research farms, and we grew a lot of crops in what we call high tunnels, which are just very inexpensive greenhouses, just made out of PVC and some plastic. And they're meant to just extend the growing season a few weeks on either end in the early spring and in the fall. And we were trying to see if it was economically viable, if it made sense for farmers to build these greenhouses, for, you know, if that cost would be offset by the increase in yield that they would get. So we grew a ton of peppers in these huge greenhouses, and we planted them as close as possible. And we gave ourselves such a narrow row to get down in between the rows of peppers that when we were harvesting, I was in kind of a half squat, half bend. And I have never been so stiff in my life. And so gardening should be a fun thing to do. So if you get done harvesting your annuals or your cut flowers and you're like, my legs are killing me, maybe next year, give yourself some more room. You are going to want to grow them closer together within their rows though. So make sure you've given yourself a nice walkway, but grow the actual plants a little closer than what's recommended on the packages. And that's going to do a few things. First of all, the more seeds you plant in the ground, the more blooms you're going to get. And so if you're going for quantity, maybe you're interested in selling plants at the farmer's market, or maybe you're just wanting to grow as many as you can to bring indoors. Growing more is just going to give you more blooms. By growing closer together, you're going to have more shade, or, you know, the annuals or the cut flowers that you're growing are going to shade the ground, which are going to discourage weeds. And then when you're growing cut flowers, it makes sense that you want to grow them close together, because what you want with cut flowers is you want tall plants and lots of stem. And when you grow plants together, that's what they do. That's kind of their natural reaction to being close together. So that's really important. But there are a couple of spacing things to just consider. So plants that are one and done plants, like these are celosia, sunflowers are this way. You plant one seed, you get one plant, you cut the one plant, and then you're done with that little space. Most of those like to be planted a little bit closer together. So maybe 6 inches by 6 inches. This is gonna encourage that upright, vigorous growth. And it's also gonna help a little bit with support as well. And then you can just get you can get a lot of plants in a 6 inch or in a row if you're growing them that close together. For plants that are your just average cut flower annuals, perennials are a little bit different. We're going to talk about that when we get to the perennials. You're going to want about a 9 inch by 9 inch spacing. So 6 inches by 6 inches, great for those upright growers, but not quite enough room for your average everyday annual. And this is actually a bachelor button, which is sometimes grown as a biennial, but it's anyways, but for production purposes, you grow them as an annual. But these are like your dahlias, your poppies, these cute bachelor buttons. You're going to want to just space them a little bit further apart, but not as far apart as your bulkier growers or ones that produce a lot of foliage. So this is an amaranth plant. It's the same plant that you get the amaranth seed from. But they've bred them to have really bright, fun colors, and these are used quite a bit in flower arranging as kind of a filler. But they can get kind of big and bulky, and so it's a good idea to give these guys a little bit of space. Other plants that would fall into this category would be like cosmos, or I just lost it. I was just thinking of one, but we'll get to it when we get to the specific plants. But it's a good idea. The big bulky plants, make sure that they have at least a foot of space all to themselves. Sun exposure is so important. So for the purpose of this class, we're going to assume that all the plants we talk about, unless otherwise specified, need full sun exposure. And by that, we mean at least 6 hours of good full sun. So this doesn't include the hour, the first couple hours of the day and the last couple hours of the day where it's cool and the sun's at an acute angle. Most really heavy bloomers like to have a lot of sun. Some of them you can get away with growing in partial sun or partial shade, but they're just not going to produce nearly as well. And what we find is that their vase life tends not to be quite as long as if they're grown in full sun. So that's what you're looking for with your cut flowers. Soil is so important. So for those of you that joined us, not last week, but the week before, we taught a class on composting. And we talked about soils as well. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about how to amend your soil or anything like that. If you're looking for an in-depth class on soils, get online to where we post all of our classes, and that class should be up there. But we're going to talk a little bit about soils and about soil structure versus soil texture. So basically this is what type of soil you have, which is sand, clay, or loamy soil, versus how workable the soil is. And the word that we use in soil science when we talk about workability or how good the soil structure is called tilth. So that's kind of a fun word to learn, tilth. So when it comes to soil texture is simply the ratio of sand, silt, and clay in your soils. And you can see by this image that the sand particles and the silt particles are roughly the same shape. They're basically just rock that's been worn down for years and years and years and years and years to be really fine particles. But they're relatively large, and because they're large and they're irregular shaped, they don't really stack on top of each other. You end up having large pore spaces, which is perfect for water and air and nutrients to travel down through the soil. Silt is just a smaller version of clay, or sorry, silt is just a smaller version of sand, but clay is kind of a beast all in itself. So clay is the finest soil particle, an individual clay particle cannot be seen with the naked eye. It's too fine. And not only is it so small, but it's actually what we call platy structure. So there's another fun vocabulary word for you, platy, which is just, it's almost like bricks stacked on top of each other. So you have a very, very fine particles. So lots of surface area that are going to hang on tight to the water as it passes through. And then it's kind of that brick structure. So that's going to hinder water and air moving through the soil as well. And clay soils are extremely prone to compaction. So when you're prepping your bed or you're prepping your soil to plant anything, I would really recommend amending soil. If you have clay soils or sandy soils, really any soils, we would recommend amending it. So how do you know what type of soil you have? Once again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but there are a couple of ways where you can find out the texture of your soil. And if you're a soil scientist, chances are you're pretty good at just doing the touch and feel test. But that can be kind of confusing because you can have a predominantly clay soil that feels gritty. It's just the ratio of sand, silt, and clay. So you can do the jar test where you take a jar, fill it up about a third of the way with sand, or not sand, sorry, with the soil from your garden. Take it from different areas of your garden, fill it up the rest of the way with clean water, shake it up really good. And I mean really good. Don't give it a little shift back and forth, but shake it up for a few minutes. And then let it sit for preferably 24 hours, and then come back to it. And you should be able to see the layers of sand, silt, and clay. The sand will settle at the bottom first. Silt is the next dense, so it's, or next large, I guess. So it'll settle in the middle, and then clay is so fine, it takes it a little while to settle out of the water. And so it's going to be usually the smallest layer on top. So you're going to take the height of each layer and divide it by the total height of all of the layers, and then times it by 100 to get your percentage, which we talked about this in our composting class, to get the percentages of clay versus silt versus sand in your soil. And then you're going to apply it to what we call the soil texture triangle. If you Google soil texture triangle, this is what's going to come up. Like, there's not a lot of, this is pretty universal. So like if you had, for easy math, if you had 50% sand in your soil and then 25% silt, so about right here, and 25% clay, you're going to end up in a sandy clay loam soil, which isn't bad. It's best to be somewhere here in the middle. But there's really not a lot you can do about changing the texture of your soil. The amount of amendments that you'd have to add to change the texture is astronomical, and it's just not feasible for most people. For some learning gardens, they might take the time and put the money into doing this. Like Red Butte Gardens has one of the most beautiful water-wise learning gardens I've ever seen. It's so impressive. But it's only a few years old. And when they did it, they took their natural soil and added so many different amendments to it that they literally changed the texture of their soil to have it be ideal for that low water environment. But most of us don't have that capacity for our own yards. So the best thing that we can do is add compost, which I'm going to talk about. But here's why knowing the texture of our soil is so important. Texture heavily influences how water moves through the soil. And it really makes sense if you think about it, because sandy soil is made up of very large particles with large pore spaces. You pour some water on it and it just pours right down through. With clay soils, tiny pore spaces that water gets trapped in, and so as you add water, it slowly seeps into the soil, and a clay soil is going to hold on to the water much more efficiently than a sandy soil is, and it's going to hold on to nutrients as well much more efficiently than a sandy soil. I would choose not to garden in either of these if I could help it, but if I had to pick one, I'd probably choose a sandy soil. But there are things that you can do to help besides trying to change the texture of your soil, which, as I said, is not really practical. The best thing you can do though is add organic matter to the soil. And by organic matter, I'm not talking about things that were raised without chemicals. I'm talking about things that were once living, like trees, leaves, bark, wood chips, plant material, vegetable peelings, fruit peels, anything like that can be composted down and added to your soil, and it's very, very healthy. So you can do your own compost pile by watching our last class video and following those principles, or you can buy it from the store. Typically compost bought in bags, depending on the brand that you get, can be, well, it totally depends, but the prices really range. You can splurge a lot for your compost, or you can get the cheap stuff. But I would just be a little bit wary about what's been in it. Typically, if they're in a bag, it means they should have been composted completely. But when you open up the bag, give it a good whiff, and if it smells like ammonia, like the smell that you get when you're passing like a dairy farm, either take it back to the store and get a different compost, or you need to let it sit for a little while until that urea smell is gone, that ammonia smell is gone. But you can buy it, you can make your own, but adding organic matter is so important. And the reason why is because it improves our soil structure. So here's just a little image about what that kind of looks like. So when we add organic matter to our soil, it breaks down into what we call humus, which is not hummus. I did have hummus though for lunch and it was delicious, but it breaks down into humus, which is like a really fine glue almost that holds all the soil particles together in what we call an aggregate. So even if you have really fine clay soil, you know, as those are bound together in aggregates, all of a sudden you have larger pieces that are bound together that are going to increase drainage, it increases airflow, it increases, for sandy soils, it's going to improve water retention, and it's going to improve nutrient retention as well. So the goal is to have good soil structure. It's not necessarily about changing the texture. And to do that, you add organic matter. And so here's just an illustration. You can see the different aggregates that have formed. You have large soil particles, maybe a bit of sand, and then you have the finer particles, maybe just some silt and some clay. But because it's forming these larger aggregates, all of a sudden we have pore space for stuff to flow down through the soil. And this is very healthy for the soil. So that's kind of what we're aiming for. So we always recommend that if you have an area that you haven't planted yet, but you're wanting to plant, just add organic matter to it. Even if you're like, you know what, I actually have pretty good soil, still just add a little bit of organic matter. It's not going to do any harm. And it could be like make a world of difference for your plants. But we really recommend adding about 2 inches of compost evenly spread out over your planting bed, and then mix it into the top 8 to 12 inches of soil. Now, there is an option where you can pay someone to analyze your soil for you. In Utah, our land grant school is Utah State University up in Logan. So you can take a soil sample, send it to them, and they're going to break it down for you. They're going to tell you the texture of your soil. They're going to tell you how much phosphorus and potassium there is in your soil. And when you're filling out the form, you're going to mark the box that says, I want to grow flowers. And when they send you back the results, they're going to say, because you're growing flowers in this space, and based on the amount of nutrients we see in the soil, we're going to recommend that you add this much nitrogen and this much phosphorus and this much potassium. And you can kind of, well, you end up saving money usually. It's only $30 for the test. And $30 is a bag of fertilizer. So if it saves you 1 bag of fertilizer a year, it's paid for itself. So it's not a bad idea. You go to USUAL, which stands for Utah State University Analytics Lab.usu.edu, and it walks you right through the process. It's pretty simple. So this is kind of an interesting tidbit, and I don't know if you can see because my video, but try adding topsoil to containers for extra water retention power. So Utah State University, like I said, is our land grant school. They're doing a lot of research on proper growing practices specifically for Utah. And they've been doing some research where they've been testing water retention capacity in raised beds, and they found that if you add a little bit of actual soil, it's the water retention goes way up. Like a lot of people have a hard time keeping their containers well watered in the hottest part of the year, like right now, where we're hitting these 100-degree days, you know, over a week or two. Sometimes you have to water twice a day to keep your pots looking good. But just by adding some different amendments, you can really improve that. So some concerns that people have with adding soil is sometimes it has weeds in it, which can be a problem. If you just scoop soil from your garden, you don't know if there's diseases in there that are going to affect the plants. The best option probably is just buying a bag of topsoil from your nursery. And if it's been bagged, it should be sterilized, but sometimes that's not always the case. So it's just something to try. You could try coconut coir or some extra peat moss to try and help that water retention as well. Most bags of potting mix that you get, they're a combination of compost, perlite or vermiculite, which are the little white things that you see, and they're just there to help with drainage, and then some kind of peat moss. So most of them don't even have any actual soil from the earth in them, but adding a little bit can make a big difference. And speaking of watering, most cut flower plants, particularly annuals, which are the hard hitters of the cut flower world, need to be kept evenly moist. So what that is you don't really want the soil to dry out in between waterings. Like most perennials especially like to have dry roots in between waterings. So you water them, you wait until the soil is relatively dry before you water them again. Most annuals that produce a lot, they need to be kept fairly moist. So you don't want it to be sopping, probably not, especially if they're grown in the actual soil, like in the ground. You probably aren't going to need to water them every day, but you are going to want to watch and make sure that they're getting enough water. And it's kind of hard to give really definite, like, here's how long you should water and here's how often you should water, because that changes drastically through the season as temperatures increase and decrease. But it also really changes depending on what type of plant you're growing. So I would take the time, no matter what you're growing, to do a little bit of homework and make sure you know the watering needs and the fertilizing needs of all the plants you're gonna plant. Because we're a water conserving garden, we always like to recommend that people hydrozone, which is not only going to save water, but it's best for the health of your plants. And what that is it's just growing plants with similar water requirements together. So your annuals are going to typically need a lot more water than your perennials. And for those of you that don't know, annuals are plants that grow for only 1 year, they die in the winter, and you have to replant them the next year. And then perennials are plants that come back every year. So typically the annuals need a lot more than the perennials do. But just so there are some annuals that can handle having very little water, and there are some perennials that prefer having a little more water. So once again, that's one of those things where you would need to do a little bit of research to make sure that you're understanding the needs of your plants and making sure that plants are grouped together. Typically though, for trees and shrubs, they want to be watered deeply and infrequently. And we're going to talk about some really cool trees and shrubs that do amazingly well as part of a cut flower garden. So this is kind of important to talk about. So new little tiny baby plants, if you're growing them from seed, they can be kept moist through an overhead irrigation system. But as plants grow, using some kind of drip irrigation is a lot better. It's a lot easier to keep them moist. You're typically more evenly giving them moisture, or that came out really weird, but it's a more efficient method to watering. And then if you're watering overhead, you want to take care to try and change your watering habits once your plants start flowering, because excess water on the actual flower, on the bloom, can do a lot of damage. You know, there's sometimes diseases or spores that are carried in our water. There's Sometimes mold can happen. Sometimes people will wonder about like why one of their flowers, which is supposed to have a really white bloom, is kind of dingy or dull looking, or maybe kind of a beige color. That's often caused by overwatering. So water at the base of the plants, save water, more efficient, save money, save time on weeding, because it helps cut down weeds as well. So anyways, speaking of staying on top of weeding, weeds are going to do so much damage to your cut flower garden. Like, weeds are the worst, which we all know, right? We have people all the time come in and ask us about how to stay on top of weeds. And a hesitation that people have about doing intensive gardening, like maybe ripping out some grass to put in a flower bed, or you know, those type of things. People are so concerned about weeds, and that's totally valid. Weeds are weeds for a reason. They seem to grow anywhere without any water and any type of light exposure. So they're terrible, but there are some things that we can do to stay on top of them. And the first thing that I would say is just be consistent about it. So I was talking to a guy, and I've shared this story before in many classes, but it even surprised me. So I was at a conference, and I was talking to this guy who has a gorgeous garden, and he lives on, it's a 1/4 of an acre lot, so relatively good sized, and the whole thing is flower beds. He doesn't have a stitch of lawn because he just loves plants so much that in his mind lawn is a waste of space, an area that he could be growing more flowers. So he was telling me about his yard, and I was like, just out of curiosity, because people ask us all the time, like, how long do you think it takes you to weed your garden? And he's like, I'm very OCD, so I go out every single day and weed. And he says, I can get through my 1/4 acre lot in less than 10 minutes. And it's just because he's on it. Every single day he's out there, and he sees a new weed and he just pulls it. And when weeds are small, they're easy to pull, and they don't take a lot of effort. And so, and he does have everything mulched really well, which helps, which we're going to talk about. So there are a couple of ways to stay on top of the weeds that don't have as much to do with actually hand pulling weeds. And the first one is you can create a chemical barrier that's going to inhibit germination of seeds. So the brand name that everyone's familiar with is Preen, but there are a lot of off-brand options that don't cost quite as much money but seem to work just as good. So Preen is what we call a pre-emergent, and it's a granule that you put down, you work it into the soil. It does best if it can be watered in, so if you can work it in before a rainstorm or something, that's best. But what it does is it creates a very thin layer of weak chemical that is going to inhibit, or well, it's going to kill little new shoots or new seeds that have just germinated. They're very, very weak and very susceptible. So it's going to kill those without really doing any damage to your perennials that are still coming up. Pros and cons to this method. Pros, it's very effective if you do it right. If you buy the off-brand, it can be quite inexpensive. Even if you buy the Preen brand, the amount of time that you save not having to weed usually offsets the cost. It's really easy to apply. Cons, you do have to reapply it usually halfway through the summertime. And then some people are a little bit wary about doing chemicals in the garden, and that's totally understandable. That's totally fine. But as far as I know, there's really not a good organic option to Preen. I've heard before where people will put like corn meal in their garden, and I don't think that lasts very long, and I don't know if it's very effective. So I've never tried it, but just, you know, some things to think about. You can use a bark mulch instead if you would prefer. And you can just tuck it right up against the plants, and they will do just fine. And bark mulch is a very efficient way at keeping weeds at a manageable level. You'll always have some that make it through. It doesn't matter what type of mulch you use. Some weeds are going to make it through, but it's going to drastically cut down on the amount of weeds. Pros and cons to bark mulch. It can be kind of expensive. And then if you're using it in an area where you are wanting to, maybe you're going to really intensively do some annual crops, so you're going to rip them out, and then you want to reincorporate some organic material into your soil, you'd have to cultivate in the bark as well. Pros though, bark is so good at keeping moisture in the soil. And it looks really nice. And I don't know, this is what we use in our learning garden here, just around our perennials, trees, and shrubs. And I have no complaints about it. I think it's awesome. You can try doing a plastic mulch. So plastic mulches maybe don't look super great. They can look kind of industrial, which a lot of people don't like, but they're just as efficient at keeping weeds at bay. And one thing about plastic mulch is it is incredibly inexpensive compared to the other stuff, which we're going to talk about next. But so I did a little bit of math, because this is what I want to do in my yard next year. I let the weeds get away from me. And so I was like, oh, I need to like practice what I preach and put down some kind of mulch. And I was just doing some pricing, and for a 1/4 acre worth of plastic mulch to put down like this, you're only looking at about $200 well, no, I guess it was just under a 1/2 acre. Is that what I said? I can't remember, but either way, it's pretty economical. Some cons to plastic is it really is not meant to be used for more than 1 year. So it is kind of wasteful, you know. Sometimes people will roll it up and use it a couple years, but plastic does break down pretty quickly in the sun, and so it really isn't meant to be used year after year after year, but it is really inexpensive. The alternative to a plastic mulch, but if you like the same principle, is some kind of weed barrier fabric. So a lot of weed barrier fabrics will last forever if they're kept out of the sunlight. But for gardening like this, there's no way to keep it out of the elements. So it's going to see a little bit of sunlight, or a lot of sunlight, but you can get really high quality fabric that is meant to last in the sun for 5, 10 years, you know. So you can use it year after year after year. And this particular picture is from, for those of you who haven't heard of Floret Farms, it's a farm up in, I think, Washington, where they do cut flowers. But so these are celosia plants here, and she has this weed barrier fabric where she's taken a template, and every 6 inches they've burned a hole. So, you know, they roll it out in the springtime. They staple it down with landscape fabric staples, which I should have brought one to show. And then they plant their plants directly in the holes, and then it's virtually weedless. You know, they have to go in a couple times a season to just weed out, you know, the weeds that come up in the actual plants. But it's just a very effective way to keep plants down if you're doing a large scale system. But this is much, much, much more expensive than the plastic mulch. So plastic mulch, like I said, $200 for about a 1/2 acre, just under a 1/2 acre. So, and of course I didn't look at that many resources, but for an equivalent amount of weed barrier fabric, of the good stuff, you're looking at a couple grand, you know. So it's just what works in your budget, what makes sense for you. So when it comes to just general maintenance, besides weeding and watering, fertilizer is really important. So a lot of plants that are grown to grow a lot of blooms take up a lot of nutrients out of the soil. So it's really important that we give them what they need if we're expecting them to perform the way that we want. So for fast growing annuals that we want to just, you know, crank out blooms, most of those like to have frequent fertilizer on a weekly or even bi-weekly basis. A lot of the big growers, they'll do it through through their irrigation systems. Like I worked through high school at Willard Bay Gardens, which is a nursery up in Willard, and we had a huge tank that we would pour fertilizer in, and it would inject it into the watering system. So every week, all of those little plants were getting watered every time we watered them. So yeah, so that's a good option. using a slow release granular fertilizer can be an awesome option, especially if you're growing plants in containers. They're little granules that you add and then they slowly release fertilizer over time. Those are perfect. Most perennials though that you grow in the ground only need fertilizer once or twice a year. And then for trees and shrubs, once a year is typically really adequate. If you're adding organic matter annually, you can significantly cut down on the need to fertilize as much or as often. So that's just kind of something to remember for those annual beds. And I put this slide in here just because a lot of people are really wary about using chemicals, which as I say, is totally understandable. But there are a lot of really great organic options out there for fertilizer. So there are great granular options that you can put into any old spreader and just spread through your garden. It's really easy peasy. One downside to the organic options versus the synthetic is the organic options typically have less nutrients per pound of fertilizer. So you might have to add a little bit more to meet the needs of your crops, which typically isn't too big of an issue when growing flowers. Sometimes growers who grow like corn or really high nutrient needing crops, sometimes they struggle because it's hard to get the crops everything they need in the quantities that they need. But for flowers, organic options typically work just as well. They do tend to be more expensive, but there are great granular options, like I said, and there are a lot of really good liquid options if you choose to go that route. Watching out for pests is important. So keeping pests at bay is so important for cut flowers because we're growing them with the point of them adding beauty to our spaces, right? So if you were a grower who had a farm and you were growing cut flowers, if you tried to take plants to market with holes in the leaves or in the buds, you would be laughed out of the marketplace, right? Like nobody wants a flower that looks like a doily because it's been chewed on by too many grasshoppers. But there are some great organic options, and there are great synthetic options as well. So if you had aphids on your plant, you could walk into IFA or J&J's or Valley Nursery and say, hey, I have aphids on my roses. I need a great way to get rid of those. And they'll give you probably a dozen options that you could use. But for small pests like aphids and mites, insecticidal soaps can be a great option if you want to go the organic route. BT is just it's a natural biological killer for caterpillars, which can be a big issue on some plants like dahlias, or if you're growing like ornamental kale or cabbage to put into your cut flower arrangements, caterpillars can just be the freaking worst. And so that's a great option. I know that they have some really great organic options as well for grasshoppers that are pretty good. But the thing to remember if you're going to go with an organic option is you have to stay on top of it. Like you have to put out the bait for the caterpillars before it's an issue. You have to put out the bait for the grasshoppers before it becomes an issue. And those are the best ways to take care of it. So I would really highly recommend that if you have the space where you're like, I'm going to grow a lot of flowers, and even if you want to grow plants specific for cut flowers in your containers, I would recommend trying to grow things from seeds. And there's a few reasons why. First of all, it's so much fun. This was when I was working at the nursery. Growing things from seeds was so much fun. There was something so satisfying about walking into the greenhouse in February and it smells like earth and it's warm, and we have these trays of little tiny baby plants and we would gently pull them apart to put them in bigger pots, and it's so satisfying and it's so much fun. But there are a few reasons why I would recommend growing from seed, even if you're like, well, I'm not into fun, Janice. I don't need to grow seeds to have fun. Well, growing plants from seeds will give you a pretty good jump on the growing season. And it's very economically, it just makes sense, right? Like one seed packet could have 300 seeds in it for $5. And even after you pay the price for the soil and the containers and all the time, it's quite inexpensive to grow from seed versus buying starts from the nursery. And most nurseries don't actually carry varieties that are specific for cut flowers. So some of them will do finest cut flowers, but what they're mostly focused on are plants that are going to do well in containers, that are going to look good throughout the season, that are going to stay compact and have a flush of flowers on a small form. So the varieties that you find in the nurseries are not nearly as good as the ones that you can find online. And we're going to talk a little bit about that here in a second. So I would just do it. It's so much fun. Just try it once and then swear off it if it was a terrible experience. But try it just once and I think you guys will be hooked. But one thing to be really wary of when it comes to growing from seeds is there's a thing called damping off, which is where the little seedlings either have too much water in the soil or more likely it's just too moist in the air. So a lot of the time people will opt to put like some kind of dome, a plastic dome over the seeds that they're growing, which is a great option to help keep things moist without keeping them soggy. But as soon as those little starts come up, you need to start giving them plenty of airflow. Otherwise, you're going to have issues with damping off. And you can tell it's damping off instead of something else, because if you look at the stalk, it's going to look like somebody's just come in and like pinched the bottom right above the soil. It looks like something just pinched it. So you'll have a nice fat, I just lost what it's called, a nice fat stem, and then it just like pinches off. So be aware of that. If you're going to reuse containers from year to year, or if you're using just some kind of plastic container, maybe it's a yogurt cup, maybe it's a solo cup, just make sure everything is sterile before you use it. That includes your hands too. Make sure hands are washed. The last thing you want to do is introduce bacteria into your growing operations. Bacteria can take out plants really quickly. Let's see. Select a seedling specific potting soil. That's really important. And when it comes to fertilizing, if you are using a potting soil, you should be fine for the first weeks of a plant's life. You won't need to hit them with any fertilizer. And you'll probably need some supplemental light. In Utah, we don't have as much light in the winter as we do in the summer, obviously. So it's going to make sense for you, especially while you're getting your plants started, to add some supplemental light. Plants typically, like I said, they want 6 hours of good sunlight. So plants want that too. And then count, when it comes to knowing when to plant, just count back from the last frost date to determine when to plant. So here we have a package of zinnias, which are one of the hard hitters when it comes to the cut flower world. You can buy so many cool zinnias. They look great. They do great in vases. But a lot of them will just say straight up, like, start seeds indoors 4 to 5 weeks before setting out. Great. So, you know, in Utah, our last frost day is typically around Mother's Day. So May 11th is when we tell people they can start planting tender plants outside. So just start in April, midway through April, just start planting things indoors and have a nice crop of flowers ready to go outside as soon as you can. And then really consider doing what we call successive plantings, which is where you plant a crop and then 2 weeks later you plant a row of the same crop, and then 2 weeks later you plant a row of the same crop. And this is really good for those plants that are one and done plants, like we talked about celosia, or sunflowers where you plant one seed and you get one flower off that one seed. Plants like dahlias or cosmos that grow in more of like off a bush, those ones you can plant one time and then you're going to get good blooms all through the season. But those one and done plants, it's a good idea to just plant them every couple of weeks to make sure you have a good amount going. So a lot of our annuals particularly, and some of our perennials, particularly perennials that are specifically meant for cut flowers, need to have a little bit of support. A lot of them have very vigorous upright growth, which is what we want because we want nice long stems. But that can give them a tendency to topple over, especially if you live in a windy area. So here we have a couple of different support systems. So we have some sweet peas growing up against a string type of support system. This is a really good, really cheap option. Cattle paneling does really well for vine type plants. This is the corral system where you have either like a T-post or a wooden post placed around your rows of plants. These are chrysanthemums that somebody has growing. And then you just string strings on the side, and that just is going to help support those plants. If there's a wind that comes up, it helps them support each other. If you have plants that try and grow outside of the string, you just gently pick up the string and gently push them back underneath. And this is a really good, cheap option to support your plants. This is what a lot of growers do as well for like raspberries and berry crops. If you have plants that need a little bit of extra support, these are also chrysanthemums, but things like these gladiolus or peonies are really notorious for just bending over because their blooms get so darn big. A lot of people will opt for a grow through system where you create kind of a frame like this person has done with these sticks, and then they've stretched this large netting over these sticks, and then they just allow the plants to grow up through the netting. If you're growing perennials or even annuals in a smaller scale system, you can buy these wire grow through supports. I've seen them at so many nurseries, and then you just put them over the plant and let your plant grow through them. So this is particularly popular with peonies. So we're going to talk for just a second. I just realized that I've already been almost going for an hour and we haven't even hit specific plants yet. But when it comes to taking care of your cut flowers, there are a few things you can do to maximize the amount of time that your flowers are going to look good in their vase. And the first thing is to make sure everything is sanitized. We already talked about this. If you get a bacteria in the water, it's going to inhibit those plants from taking up water and staying hydrated, and they're going to die much, much quicker than if you had nice sterile vases, nice clean water, nice clean shears that you're cutting everything with. Just make sure everything is cleaned well. It's really important to harvest during the coolest hours of the day. So the way that plants pull up water out of the soil is they have little tiny pores on their leaves that they open up to allow oxygen in so that they can photosynthesize and make sugar so that they can keep growing. But they open those up typically during the day to allow oxygen in while they're getting energy from the sun. And then when they open up, water evaporates from outside of the plant, which creates kind of a pulling effect. So it's kind of like sucking up water through a straw. And so when you harvest during the middle of the day when it's hot, those pores are still open and water is being lost. So you harvest the plant, take it in, and it's already losing water, and it's gonna droop and waste away in the vase a lot quicker than if you were to cut them in the early morning or late evening when those pores are closed and there's a maximum amount of water inside the plant. So that's optimum. Pick blossoms at the right stage. There is no rule of thumb for this. This is another one of those things where if you decide you want to grow a specific flower, you need to do the research to find out when you want to, or when you're going to need to harvest them. Because some blossoms fall off as soon as they're pollinated, so you're going to need to pick them well before they open up. Some, won't open after they're picked, so you're going to need to harvest those flowers when they're full. So you're just, that's for you to figure out for your own garden. We're going to talk about a few specifics when we get into specific plants, but not right here. This one seems obvious because it kind of is. Use cold water, that's clean. Don't use warm water. Letting the stems rest can do a lot of good for the longevity of the flowers in a vase. And that's just where after you've harvested them, set them in a pitcher of cold water or a vase of cold water for a couple of hours, just to let them hydrate, keep them nice and cool, and that's going to help them stay. The plant science term we use is called turgid, and that's just, it means they're gonna stay like plump and really full of water. So letting the stems rest will help the flowers stay turgid. Floral preservatives do a lot of good. So there's some people out there that are like, no, you don't need a floral preservative. It's not that big of a help. It is. Sometimes it can extend the life of a flower up to a week. And preservatives, they're made of sugar. They have some kind of acid component to them, and then a biocide. So sugar to keep the plants, healthy, like they'll still continue to take up nutrients even after they're cut. The acidifier is in there to help encourage the plants to continue taking up water. And then the biocide is just a little chemical that keeps bacteria from growing. Most of them are very organic and very good. Recutting the stems is so important. So because water is being pulled up through the straw effect, right? Like there's a lot of tension in the stem of a plant. So when you cut that, the tension, you break the tension and the stem will suck up just a little bit of air. And so if you put that stem directly into your vase and your final nice bouquet, that air pocket at the bottom of the stem is going to keep your flower from pulling up more water and staying hydrated. So this is very important. After you've done the initial cut in the garden, take it into your kitchen sink, hold it underneath the water. So like fill up a container or fill up your sink with water, hold the stem underneath and take your pruners and cut off the bottom 2 inches of the stem. And what that does is when you break the tension again and it's going to suck in water instead of air. So that's going to help your plants stay hydrated longer. And then this is really important. Change water if it gets murky, even if the flower looks fine. There are a couple of plants out there that when you cut them, they release some stuff into the water and it makes it look murky. It is just bad. So just keep the water nice and clear and clean. Just take the bouquet out, dump the water in the sink, fill it back up and put your bouquet back in, and it will work out fine. So now we're going to get into some specific annuals. Like I said, annuals are kind of the heavy hitters of the cut flower world. So we're going to go over some favorites and some of the most popular and some of the easiest to grow. So bear with me. We're just going to talk about each of these for just a few seconds. Like I said, these will be online afterwards. So if y'all need to bail because this is getting long, you're more than welcome to. But sweet peas are a lot of fun because they're so darn easy to grow. And they come on so early. So when you've got those winter blues and you're just really wanting spring to come along, plant some sweet peas in your garden. They're kind of like regular peas where as soon as you can work the soil, you can plant your sweet peas. So plant them in late winter, early summer. Peas actually do really, really well if you can soak the seeds before planting. That'll put you ahead of the game just by a few days. It's not a big deal if you don't, but if you're just trying to get just a few more days on the beginning of your growing season, then soaking them can do a lot of good. They do require some kind of trellising to support. So at my house where I had just a 10-foot by 10-foot pad of concrete, I grew sweet peas one year. I turned a tomato cage upside down, a really tall tomato cage, and they were at the top of that thing within just a couple of weeks. It was pretty impressive, and I got so many sweet peas off that plant. They do require quite a bit of water, so it's kind of nice that they are at their largest growing peak when it's cooler and it's easier to keep them watered. There are some sweet peas that do okay in the summer, and they do require a lot of irrigation. But there are most of the varieties, the most popular varieties are early spring bloomers, so it's easier to keep them moist. Snapdragons, so much fun. They're also one of those annuals that are semi-hardy, so you can plant them out about a whole month before the last frost. So if you've got them started inside for a month, you plant them out a month before the danger of last frost has passed. That's 2 whole months that you're able to add to your growing season, and they grow really quickly. These guys are those plants that like to have a little bit more room, so give them about a foot, that 12-inch spacing, and you're going to want to pinch them to encourage more blooms. So plants grow by directing hormones places. Every time you cut a plant, you're changing the hormone in the plant. So most plants like to grow, well, not most, but a lot of plants like to grow up. So you look at a pine tree, it's a specific hormone that is telling that tree we're growing up. So with a lot of these annuals, especially the annual perennials, they want to grow up. You pinch them off, that forces them to grow out, and all of a sudden, instead of having a few, 1, 2, or 3 nice stalks that you're harvesting, you pinch it off. When the plant has about 6 true leaves on it, you pinch it about halfway back, and then all of a sudden you're going to have a lot more flowers to harvest. This snapdragon specifically, don't buy snapdragons in the little containers from the nursery if you want to use them for cut gardens. Most of those are specifically bred to be small and compact, and a lot of those are actually treated with hormones to keep them small and compact. And they're so easy to grow that just buy a package of seeds from online. They're a lot of fun. But these are ones that after they're pollinated, the blossoms fall off. So you wait until the very bottom flowers are just opening up. The rest will just be buds. You harvest them, take them inside, and then enjoy watching them open up. Zinnias, you can't talk about cut flowers without talking about zinnias. They're really nice for our region because they are so darn heat tolerant. These also like to be pinched back, and they also like to have a little bit more room. So super easy to grow. This is kind of a tip. If you're wondering when to harvest, so these ones you do harvest when they're all the way open, and they need to be all the way open. You shake the plant a little bit, and if the stem is kind of bouncing back and forth, then it's not ready to be harvested. But if you shake the plant and the stem is staying really erect, then that's when you know that it's time to harvest. If you harvest them when they're still bending over when you shake the plant, they're not going to last very long in the vase. So cosmos are one of my favorites. They are so whimsical, so easy to grow, one of the most vigorous annuals you'll grow. But the one problem with cosmos is they don't last a very long time in the vase. We're talking like 3 to 4 days. So they're just kind of fun, but they grow so prolifically that you take a bunch in, put it in a vase, put it on your nightstand. 3 days later, you just go pick some more. Like, it's not like you're, oh no, I have to, pace myself with my cut flowers because there's not enough of them. With cosmos, the more you harvest, the more they bloom. So they're kind of fun that way. Dahlias are my favorite annual. I can say that with confidence. They're by far my favorite annual. They are extremely cold sensitive, so we don't want to plant them out until about 2 weeks after the last frost date has passed. They don't want to be planted out until soil temperatures are above 60 degrees. If you're planting out tubers, be careful and don't water them until you actually have foliage coming up out of the ground. These guys are a little bit sensitive, and by a little bit sensitive, I mean if they have one arch nemesis, it's going to be the slugs. So it's a good practice to get into that when you're growing large amounts of dahlias in one area, just put out slug bait. Before you see damage, before you see any issues, as soon as the foliage starts coming up, put down some slug bait and you'll be happy. And these are also a flower that they don't keep opening after you pick them. So you pick them when they're fully open to enjoy the blossoms. But I love dahlias. I think they almost look fake. I love how the range of flowers within just the little dahlia community is so diverse. Like, these guys almost look like a water lily, but you have ones that almost look like peonies, and you have others that almost look like daisies, so and they're relatively easy to grow besides the slugs and them not liking cold temperatures. They're pretty hardy. So I threw this one in there, and it's supposed to say herbs instead of hebs. I apologize for that. Apparently I should have proofread my slides. But herbs can be kind of a fun thing to add because a lot of them actually do okay in like a vase of water. Like, a lot of them, before they even start to wilt, they're going to start to root. So within just a couple of days, like if you add mint or basil to a pot of flowers, you'll look inside the water and see that little tiny baby roots are starting to poke out. But they're really nice because they're very fragrant. Sorry, I'm like talking fast, and so now I'm stumbling over my words, but they're very fragrant and they're easy as heck to grow. But when you're thinking about growing a cut garden or what you could add to your garden to have more interest to bring indoors with you, you have to really think about not just the blooms, but what else goes along with a bouquet. Most good bouquets are going to have some kind of greenery along with them, some kind of filler. So think about that. And mint, basil, you know, use them in cooking as well. Geraniums can be a really good option. Their flowers or their leaves and their flowers, they wilt pretty fast, but their leaves last a long time. And you can get scented geraniums that just smell amazing. So we're going to talk about biennials for a bit because there are a lot of biennials that we see in the flower shops that we can grow in Utah. So biennial means that these plants are going to fulfill their life cycle in 2 years. So the first year, if you're growing them from seed, if you buy them from the nursery, they've already gone through their first season. But if you grow them from seed, which we're recommending because it's so much fun, right? The first year, they're going to just be a crown of plants, or a crown of foliage. And you're not going to really get any blooms off of them. And by not really, I mean you're not going to get any blooms off of them. So they're just a nice little crown the first year. And then the second year, they are amazing. So the reason biennials are really nice as cut flowers is we're going to talk about some that do really good in vases, but they kind of straddle that weird gap between bulbs and then the rest of our annuals and early spring bloomers. You know, bulbs are typically so early that they're done before you're getting your good crop of dahlias or well, I almost said sweet peas, but sweet peas are so early that they kind of help bridge that gap as well. But anyways, so some of my favorite biennials, foxgloves, are so darn gorgeous. And I think that they are one of the most impressive looking flowers. Like, look at that. That is so interesting. It almost has like a leopard print pattern up in the tube of the flower. One thing to know about foxgloves is the blossoms die after they've been pollinated. So you want to pick these when they're just first starting to open up. And then the rest of so if you pick them when just the bottom ones are starting to open, put them in a vase and you can watch them bloom inside. You'll watch these top ones open up. One thing to know is that they are quite poisonous. Agatha Christie has used foxglove as the murder weapon in at least 3 Agatha Christie novels. So if it's good enough for an Agatha Christie murder weapon, you know, you can use it too. Just kidding. We don't encourage stuff like that. But just be aware. So typically there's not an issue with kids eating plants, I don't think, but if you're worried about that, maybe choose a snapdragon instead of a foxglove. Similar looks, similar growth habits, but you don't have to worry about that. But this is kind of a fun one if you have a shady area. So there's not a lot of really great flowering plants that can be used in cut vases and bouquets and stuff like that that grow well in the shade, but foxglove is one of those that in our area, in dry, hot Utah, it prefers to be in some shade. Sweet William is a really cute little dianthus. There are a lot of dianthuses that do well in our area. All of them have great shelf life. This is one of the most popular ones because it is they put on such a profusion of blooms, and they do so great in the vase. Like, we're talking 2+ weeks of vase life, which is really impressive. These ones you do harvest. You'll notice how there's kind of like a bunch of little flowers on one head. You harvest when only 2 or 3 of these have opened. You would cut them, bring them inside, and then enjoy watching the rest of them open. And the Sweet Williams are nice because not all the dianthus are very fragrant, but Sweet Williams are. And they're a biennial, which is kind of nice, kind of fun, you know, facts to know. So Canterbury bells are so darn cute. I love blue flowers. And like by blue flowers, I mean flowers that are actually blue. You know, there are a lot of flowers that are blue, but when you really look at them, you're like, well, that's like a light purple or like a really deep purple. But Canterbury bells are one of the few flowers that are an actual true sky blue color. But they come in these really cute single varieties or double varieties. And you are going to wait until the top bud on the spike is starting to open before you pick it. And these are really nice because they also have a long shelf life, up to 2 weeks, which is pretty impressive. So now we're going to move on to bulbs, tubers, and corms. And I say this, so I already talked about dahlias, and I'm like, you know, if you're going to grow it from tubers, and I put that in the annual section. So this section is mostly bulbs, tubers, and corms that are going to act a little bit more like perennials and come back year after year after year. So daffodils are so fun and so cute, and they are more diverse than you're probably thinking, which is ironic because I put the straight variety picture in. I probably should have picked something a little more exciting, but they come in whites and doubles, and some are fragrant and some are bunches of dahlias on one stem. You know, some of them are pastel pink color, some of them are a deep orange color. Like, they're kind of exciting for being a plant that I feel is given kind of a bad rap just because they're overused and a little bit old fashioned. But they're some of the earliest bloomers that we have. So they're kind of fun to grow and start bringing in flowers as early as March, you know, end of February even sometimes. With most bulbs, they do prefer being dug up and divided every year or every couple of years if possible. If you're doing like a small scale, it's just I'm growing some flowers in my backyard in my perennial beds, just leaving them in there for a few years, it's not going to hurt anything. You will see their production go down after a couple of years, but that's just something to be aware of. Ranunculus. So ranunculus, here I am being like, this section's safe for plants that are going to survive our winter. And I forgot I put this one in this section. Oops. Ranunculus are so cute though. In our area, we treat them more like a hardy annual. So they're going to be planted out with our pansies, which are so cute in a little nosegay, or with our snapdragons or those early annuals. But they're technically a perennial. They're grown from corms, which are, if you buy them, they almost look like little acorns. They're very small. But if you soak the corms before planting, you're going to shave off a couple of weeks from the growing season. So, or you're going to extend it that long. I don't know if I said that right, but by soaking the corms for 24 hours beforehand, you're going to get ranunculus blooms 2 weeks sooner than you would otherwise. And these are really awesome plants because their vase life is phenomenal. A whole 10 plus days, which is pretty impressive. And look at those blooms. Oh man, they're just so cute and pretty easy to grow. Not really fussy. Anemones, so most of the varieties, here we go again, are not hardy, Janice, but many of the most brilliant varieties that are used for cut flowers are not hardy, but there are some anemones in our area that do really, really well. We have a couple here at our learning garden of the Japanese anemones that take over an area though. So if you're gonna plant them, make sure you have the room for them. But they do really, really well. And you can find some that are marginally hardy. So if you're willing to give them a little bit of winter protection, they can do really great. Also grown from corms, also have long base lives. I love anemones. I have a hard time saying that, but it's okay. Leucojum, this is one of my favorite little flowers. I'm just gonna say that about all of them, right? That's my favorite flower. This one's my favorite flower. But leucojum are really pretty, also known as snowflake flower. The stems are only about a foot tall, so they're not super huge, but they look really good in a smaller arrangement or a nosegay, which I guess I should clarify what nosegay is. I've used it a couple of times. So nosegays they were very popular in like Victorian England, but they're like the really small, little tiny bouquets, you know, that you tuck into a pocket or you put into like a teacup or something like that. But back in Victorian England times, they like the flowers had meaning. So if you gave flowers to someone, you'd have to make sure that you weren't like sending a message that you didn't want sent, right? You didn't want people to get the wrong idea. But so these shorter little tiny flowers like pansies or violas or grape hyacinths or these leucojum do really, really well in really cute, small, delicate bouquets. So, but yeah, really nice. These ones are really, I just lost my train of thought, really early. And then they like having their stems conditioned before using, which is just, we're cutting them off, put them in some cold water before putting them into the bouquet. Otherwise, these guys do tend to wilt pretty fast. Tulips, these ones seem obvious. So many varieties. I just barely, and by just barely, I mean 2 weeks ago, ordered a few thousand bulbs for our learning garden, and I had so much fun picking them out because there are so many cool varieties. You know, in like, you guys have probably heard of like the tulip fever that happened in Holland in the like 1600s or something, but people would spend crazy amounts of money for one tulip bulb back then, like crazy amounts of money. Thank heavens we don't have to spend that much for them now. Like I think the most expensive bulbs I bought were $3 a piece, but most of them were talking 25 cents, 50 cents a piece, which if you think about it, they act like a perennial. You're getting this gorgeous flower out of it for pennies, right? Some things to really be aware of though is that after you cut a tulip, the stems will continue to elongate for a few days. So if you put them in a arrangement, they're gonna just kind of push their way out. So just tuck them in a little bit to make sure that doesn't happen. So we're moving on to perennials. And we're gonna start with peonies. I love peonies. I think they are some of the most brilliant looking flowers for hardly any work. And they're so long living. They can live up to 50 years, a peony bush can. But it is best to wait 2 or 3 years before harvesting. So after you plant, just give it a couple of years before you start intensively harvesting the bush. These ones are, they really, really like being staked or having some kind of support system. I showed you earlier that grow through system, that wire grow through circle. Peonies grow through and it just kind of supports them and keeps them from toppling over because their blooms are just so big and amazing. They need that support system. Lilies are so much fun. Technically a bulb, but we treat them more like perennials. Extremely long lasting in vases. Watch out for the pollen, which can stain. You guys are probably familiar with this, where you know you get a nice bouquet of flowers from somewhere and then you're like, where did this yellow come? How come I can't get it out of my clothes when I wash it? It's probably the pollen from a lily. These are so much fun to grow because they're a bulb, they don't need a lot of water, like hardly any water, and they divide pretty quickly. And so you can dig up the bulbs and divide them out and get more lilies, more bang for your buck, right? Which is also nice. So hops. So I threw this slide in here because I think it's really important to note that there are a lot of really cool vines, a lot of perennial vines that do so good in vases. So, and this hops is just a great example, right? So you put them in your vases full of flowers. They add a lot of texture, a lot of interest. The greenery is really good. This interesting seed head is pretty impressive. But clematis do really good. Clematis actually have a pretty long vase life. Other vines do really well. And then if it's not working out with your flowers, you can use these to flavor your homemade beverages, right? So delphiniums are a really gorgeous perennial. A lot of these are pretty short-lived, which is just something to be aware of. Also really pretty because the blue ones have that true blue color, but they come in cool colors of whites, purples, blues. Some varieties can get up to 6 feet tall. Super impressive. And I guess I should just say, when you're buying these plants, make sure that you know what you're getting. Like maybe you're like, oh, I like delphiniums. I think they're super cute. So I'm going to grow some in my garden for my cut flowers. But I don't know if you want a 6 foot tall delphinium stem in a vase in your house. There are a lot of varieties that grow a lot shorter, so just make sure you know what you're getting. They last for about a week in the vase. Black-eyed Susans are really good. They're a great late summer, early fall bloom. So that's kind of nice to just have a variety. So like when you're planting your garden, make sure you're not just filling your beds full of, or your containers full of plants that are gonna blossom in the spring, then be done, and you're not gonna have anything for the rest of the season. Make sure that you're picking plants that are gonna bloom in spring and summer and fall to make sure you have plenty to harvest from. So, and these black-eyed Susans, so the picture that I have here is the typical yellow black-eyed Susan, but they come in oranges, they come in burgundies, they come in almost brown colors, which can be kind of interesting. And they have a really long base life. Chrysanthemums, these are gonna be your fall bloomers. Most that are grown 4-cut flowers like the ones you see in the supermarket, those ones aren't technically hardy, but we have a lot of chrysanthemums that are hardy to our area. You just have to make sure to get the tall ones that are going to work in a vase instead of just the ones that stay really short and compact, and you get like the button chrysanthemums, which once again would be fun for a little nosegay. Maybe make sure you know what it means before you give it to someone though, because you don't want to accidentally break up with your girlfriend or something. But they last for a really long time in a bouquet. But these ones are, it's like weird because they start growing, but then in the first part of summer, you're gonna wanna cut them down to almost 6 inches above the ground. And that's just gonna force a ton of blooms, which is fun. Echinaceas, also called coneflower, super great, hardy in our area, drought tolerant, late summer bloomers, lasts up to 2 whole weeks in a vase. That is impressive. Comes in a slew of different colors. This is your typical straight variety black-eyed Susan, coneflower, echinacea, but they come in double varieties, some that are huge blossoms, some that are small blossoms, some that are like we have one in our garden that's like my favorite. It's called Cantaloupe Supreme, and it's like a really, really cute cantaloupe color, but they come in greens and yellows and pinks and purples. Are just really pretty. Ornamental grasses are so fun. I would highly recommend that you pick some of your favorite ornamental grasses to grow, and then you can add the actual leaves to an arrangement for some texture and some movement. But the seed heads is where you're gonna get like the wow factor. When it comes to maintenance, super low maintenance, very drought tolerant. Every 4 to 6 years, you're going to want to divide them and move them around. Give some to your neighbors. You can divide them and then put one back right where you pulled the plant from, and that'll help. Just you'll notice after 4 to 6 years, like they'll start to get a dead patch in the middle, and that just means it's time for them to be divided. Easy peasy to grow. So many options. So many. This is one that I thought was kind of interesting. So this is called, oh, I just lost it. Fiber optic grass. But this one's a weed. You see it growing along fields, and it's not like a terrible weed that's like gonna take over the freaking world, but it is known as a weed in our area. But the seed head is just so light and airy and just so cute. It would add a lot to a cut flower display. So we're gonna move on to some shrubs. Lilacs are the obvious ones. So easy to grow, drought tolerant, they smell good. So they set next year's bulbs during this year's summer. So that means you're gonna wanna do any pruning on them after they've blossomed, so that you're not accidentally cutting off next year's blossoms because you've waited too long to harvest. Does that make sense? So the rule of thumb is, well, we won't worry about that right now because we don't have time, but just if you're going to prune the lilacs, do it after they've blossomed. So these ones though, the one thing with lilacs is they have a hard time rehydrating once you put them in a vase. So they tend to, what's the word, like droop, become less turgid really quickly. So one trick you can do is you can try cutting up the stem. So if this finger's the stem, I'm gonna cut vertically like this. After I've cut it in the water, cut the end off in the water, I turn it, put it back in the water, and cut vertically. And what that's gonna do is it's just gonna open up what we call the vascular tissue of the plant to pull up the water. More surface areas exposed to pull that water up. Viburnums, amazing. So many good viburnums in our area. Snowball bushes, these are snowball bushes. This particular viburnum in the picture is not a snowball bush, but snowball bushes are a type of viburnum. But they typically have these brilliant white flowers that are followed by red berries that you can use. And then most viburnum bushes have leaves that last a long time. And these are great alternatives to hydrangeas if you're having a hard time growing hydrangeas. 9-barks are amazing. So this picture is a 9-bark plant. Cool color. The leaves, if you pick the mature leaves, they're going to last a long time in a vase. But so you have I think this is either the Diablo or the wine leaf. But then it also has this little lemon 9-bark, where you get these really cute flowers that you can use in arrangements. And then you have these amazing chartreuse colored leaves you can use. And then on 9-barks, after they're done blooming, they put out a really cute brown seed head that's very interesting for arranging. And obviously you can't talk about what cut flowers you can use that are shrubs without talking about roses. A little bit more high maintenance, but if you stay on top of it, they're not too bad. Can be kind of expensive, so try growing from bare root. And with roses, you want to wait until early spring to prune. Most trees and shrubs prefer to be pruned in the late winter. So we're talking January, February, March. But roses, you want to wait until they've already started leafing out before you prune them. And that's just because they're a little bit susceptible to winter damage. And remember those hormones, every time we cut a plant, it's going to release hormones. And when we cut plants, it releases hormones that tell it to grow. And because roses are a little more susceptible to winter damage, if we cut them during the winter time, they're going to try to bud out and grow. And then if they get hit with the frost, it's going to do more winter damage. So wait until spring to prune these. And then when it comes to diseases and pests, they are always breeding new rose varieties. And I would just look for varieties that are disease and pest free, and or just stay on top of the aphids. But roses are kind of funny to me because they're like the quintessential cut flower, and they do not last very long in a vase. A few days at the most, 4 or 5 if you're lucky. They don't last nearly as long as other flowers do, but we use them all the time. So we're going to finish up with trees here. Here we have a pussy willow. I realized I didn't put an extra slide in about pussy willows, but there are a bunch of trees that do really well that can add a lot to your cut flowers. So the first one, crab apples. So like I said, most trees and shrubs prefer to be pruned in the well, we'll talk about the rule of thumb that I just skipped. If they blossom before Mother's Day, you prune them. No, I'm just going to forget it now. After they bloom, if they bloom after Mother's Day, you prune them before they bloom. There we go. So crab apples, you're going to prune them anyways, right? Like just jump the gun a little bit and prune off some branches that are full of buds, and they are spectacular in a vase indoors. Be careful though, because they are so thirsty. So I did this once at our learning garden. We were pruning the crab apples and they were full of blooms, and by pruning I mean we were clipping some off to bring inside. So we clipped some off and we brought them inside, and I had a big pitcher, a glass pitcher full of water, full of crab apple blossoms, and I came in the next morning and like they were all droopy and no water. So just be really wary of that when you're rehydrating them after cutting them, make sure they have enough water. And then a lot of crab apples, they do have small crab apples on them that can be used for fall arrangements. Beeches are a lot of fun because the leaves last so long in a vase. So you can kind of tell just by looking at them, but they're kind of shiny and a little bit waxy, and that helps them last at least 2 whole weeks in a vase. Once again, not a lot, they're not very exciting, but when you're growing a cut flower garden, you're thinking about things like what foliage or what greenery can I add to my bouquets. Did I skip one? No, okay. Hawthorns, super pretty, adorable flowers followed by red fruit. These berries are mostly what you're going to go for with a hawthorn tree. The flowers don't last very long, but the berries will. But some hawthorn varieties are very thorny, so just be careful of that. Flowering cherries are some of the cutest blooms you've ever seen in your life anyways. But then the foliage actually on flowering cherries lasts pretty well in a vase as well. But you're growing these mostly for those adorable blossoms. Like, how amazing is that? That's almost like having a peony on a tree. So that's the end of the presentation. One thing that I do want to say before we get to questions is I am one of those people that like, just go have fun with it. If you have a flower in your garden that you absolutely love and you want to try bringing it inside, just try it. And if you look at it and 2 seconds later, it's like I've only lasted 2 hours inside, you just know not to bring it in again. And you know, like, but what harm did it do to try it? So just have fun, try new things. I love this bouquet right here because there are so many different flowers and grasses represented. We have the dahlias, black-eyed Susan. This is that tickle, well, we used to call it tickle grass when we were little, but the fiber optic glass. But we have crab apples in here. We have the scented geranium here in the background. Lots of fun things. Rose hips that, you know, the roses develop after they're done blooming. Those can be used in vases. We have nasturtiums that we didn't talk about, but these are really popular in salads. You can eat those and they're gorgeous as cut flowers. But lots of fun things to try. So I would highly recommend, if you want to really get into this, move my little video over. There's this girl, Erin, I can't remember her name. Have to read off my book, but this book, The Cut Flower Garden, is one of the most comprehensive, easy to follow, gorgeous books that is out there about cut flower gardens. I've read a handful of them, and she gets into the how-to without getting so much into like heavy research or anything like that. So she's very pleasant to read, and it's a good book. I would also recommend following her on social media as well. She's always posting pictures of her plants and her bouquets. So I think that's all I've got. It took me a little longer than I expected, but if any of you have any questions, make sure to type them in the question and answer box. I don't think we have any right now, but if you have some, I'll wait just a couple of minutes. And while you're asking questions, if you have any, if not, I'm just going to assume I did such a good job teaching that no need to have any questions, right? But so we try to teach classes once a week here at Weber Basin, and we're going to keep teaching them through September. So our next class, I just forgot what it was, but we'll be teaching it on Wednesday. Some of the topics we have coming up, we're going to be doing a bulb class later in the fall, and how to get your garden ready for the fall. We're going to do another local escapes class. Our local escapes program is pretty cool. It's focused on gardening for where you live. Like, too many of our gardening principles have been brought east from England or from the Northeast, and they just don't make sense in Utah. So we're trying to pare it down. Brody says ornamental grasses, which we've talked about. So Dave is going to teach ornamental grasses next week, Wednesday at 2 o'clock. So make sure you're on to check out the cool ornamental grasses that you can grow, add them to your cut flowers, and they're just fantastic in a yard. So we did get one question that says, miss the first part. Can we get the slides? Absolutely. So all of our classes that we've done this year are available on our website, weberbasin.com. So there's a link that says classes and events, and if you click on that, it'll pull up an option for looking at past classes, and that'll have any slides that we've used. It'll have a recording of this class that we've just done, and then if we ever have any additional stuff like a worksheet or a pamphlet, we'll also put it on there as well. So it looks like that's all the questions. Thank you guys for joining me. I love cut flowers, and I hope you guys give them a try. To figure out how to end the class. There we go.